One of the hallmarks of the Hilton Humanitarian Prize is its somewhat accidental creation of a cadre of now some 20 of the world's most successful and best humanitarian organizations, the laureates of the Hilton Prize over the years. And I say somewhat accidental because it was predictable, of course, that over a number of years awarding the best humanitarian organizations, eventually there would be this group of the best. But it wasn't really imagined at the beginning that this group would meet regularly and rediscover each other, in some cases discover each other for the first time. And we've realized that the laureates, the winners of the prize over the past 2 decades, have a lot to offer in terms of expertise, experience, and thought leadership in their fields. Joining me now are leaders of 3 Hilton Prize laureate organizations for a discussion of the global refugee crisis and how their experience applies to it. You've already got extensive biographies on all of our speakers in your program, so I'm not going to introduce them extensively. Nazanin Ash is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee. She has previously served in the U.S. State Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East region and as a policy planning staffer and for the Agency for International Development in the Bush and Obama administrations. Steve Davis is President and CEO of PATH, a global health organization. He's also worked for McKinsey, the global consultancy, as its Social Innovation Director. That's probably a title that didn't exist 15 years ago. Mr. Davis advises the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Social Innovation, the Clinton Global Initiative's Global Health Advisory Board, and is a trustee of the World Economic Forum's Global Health Challenge. But as we'll see, Steve also has some early career experience in Asia on refugee programs and policies. Dr. John Lawrence, on your far right, is president of the board of directors of Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, in the United States. He's a practicing pediatric surgeon, currently on staff at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn, here in New York. Dr. Lawrence has served on 8 surgical missions since 2009 in Central African Republic, Ivory Coast, Haiti, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and in Syria, which of course is at the heart of one of today's most critical refugee crises. Welcome to all of you. We're going to have a bit of a discussion here today, and I think as we think about the humanitarian crisis the refugee crisis represents, it's a little bit too easy maybe to forget that these refugee crises are distinct. They have different motivations. Some of them are political, some of them are war-related, some of them are health-related, climate-related, and so on, economically related. And so, Nazanin Ash, I'd like to ask you first, but everybody should chime in on this. Are there common threads in dealing with refugee crises around the world that you can draw lessons from and say, well, no matter what the origins of them are, these are things we can see in every single one of these places that might serve as a bit of a lesson or a bit of a useful tool for the people here in the audience who are thinking about how to target what they do with regard to refugee crises in the regions they're working in. Nazanin?
Thank you so much, Frank. And let me please also say thank you so much to the Hilton Foundation for organizing a tremendous symposium with an amazing agenda. It's a privilege to be up here with my fellow panelists and to be on the agenda with such a remarkable group of presenters. Thank you. Such an important question. I think the crises that we see today are characterized by 3 common threads that, as you note, indicate that lead to a set of common trends that indicate how our responses should be shaped. One, they're primarily conflict-driven, and the specific characteristic of that conflict is that it's intrastate. So tools and international mechanisms that were set up to resolve conflicts between states are difficult to apply to these conflicts that are now intrastate, civil wars that have the distinct characteristic of lasting a long time, average length of intrastate conflict being 37 years. So that says something about the duration of displacement, that on average refugees are displaced now for 10 years or more, which is a significant trend that the sector needs to respond to. It's also characterized by violence against civilians. And I think it was so notable that your symposium agenda notes that today is the day in 1938 that the League of Nations, the precursor to the UN, passed a resolution on preventing the bombing of civilians. And yet we live in an era now where interstate conflict, as I know my MSF colleagues will affirm, is characterized by violence against civilians and the inability of our current set of tools, political and humanitarian, to be able to respond to that. 4 UN Security Council resolutions in Syria, for example, on preventing violence against civilians that have been extremely difficult to enforce. So again, you have long-term trends you have violence against civilians leading to a tremendous exodus, half the population of Syria displaced as an example. And then they're fleeing to urban centers because they know that displacement, because displacement may be of such a long duration, they're not settling into camps where they may be cut off from education or employment opportunities. They're going to urban areas, which again presents a different challenge for a humanitarian sector that was set up to respond to short-term crises in camps to address immediate needs. And now we need to shift to opportunities that allow refugees to not only survive, but rebuild and recover and thrive.
All right. Dr. Lawrence, do you want to comment on this common threads aspect?
Yes, you bet. So I think, I would add to what Nazanin's already brought up, that probably viewing it at 2 different levels. First of all, at the personal level, it's very easy to start talking about figures and statistics and get caught up in the 65 million individuals who are currently globally either refugees or internally displaced. But when you're actually working in the field, when you extract that back down to the person or the human being involved, I think a very common thread is that unlike what's often portrayed in the press these days, these aren't opportunists. These are people who are victims of violence, of persecution, whose lives have been filled with nothing but instability. So if you tick through the first 3 places, the first 3 countries in the world that are creating most of migrant populations these days, Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia, I think it would characterize probably the 3 most unstable, insecure places that we could imagine. And so the rhetoric which has been so prevalent of these are people who are, are basically out sort of seeking voluntarily a opportunity that may be better than what they can find in their native country, is very much distorts, I think, the magnitude or the severity of just how desperate they are to really find a better life in any regard. I think speaking more to something that both my organization and myself personally can probably add, which is about the medical needs of these populations and what exists across the board there. I think I would say that, again, a couple of themes that come forward. One, their healthcare needs are just like the healthcare needs of people anywhere in the world, only it's just so much more challenging because of this migratory nature of their existence at this point, and or the status of what services exist in refugee resettlement camps or even in informal settings that can't really even be qualified as camps. And I think, one of the second things I like to bring up is which was already touched on by, I think, both of our previous speakers this morning, which is the issues of mental health and the impact that violence has on the lives of individuals, and particularly how vulnerable populations, women and children, are afflicted by this. And so, again, the image we see of an adult male being the one who's actually the migrant that we're viewing is in many ways a minority population of the group that we need to be considering. And so I think we lose sight of that commonality, as well as how there's particular populations who are really most afflicted by this crisis.
Just a quick follow-up. Does it make it harder or easier for a group like yours to go, because you talked about the challenges of the medical care aspect, does it make it harder or easier the fact that the refugees are either locked into their own countries, they're internally displaced, or they are in someplace else where languages, medical care, geography, climate, all kinds of other things are different from what they're accustomed to. How does it affect what you do as a humanitarian organization? Does it make any difference to you?
Well, so I think to answer the first part of that question, when we talk about, again, the places that are producing the most refugees at this point in time, and thereby talking about the internally displaced people that are maybe, I would say, even hoping to become refugees, and be able to get outside of the borders of their country, but Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, incredibly difficult places to work, and I'm sure everyone in this room knows the challenges and maybe I would say the collective failings of what the rest of us in the world have not done to try to prevent what the populations in Syria are experiencing, but it's really not that much different in Afghanistan. It's really not much different in Somalia either. So very, very difficult. Where and again, one of the first things that happens when you have instability is that there's a tendency for the educated population and those with means to leave early on, which includes healthcare providers in many circumstances. So the standards dip below where they may have already been previously. Trying to work outside of of a particular country that is producing the refugees also has its own set of challenges. I would argue that it's somewhat easier there because you're at least in what's a secure setting, but again, many difficulties in terms of trying to access care within the local country that's hosting these populations. They're being overwhelmed by the numbers of what they're seeing. And I think it's also important to remember in that regard that even though we think of this, the problem with refugees migrating into an advanced country, but 86% of the refugees in the world are actually going into lower middle income countries. So these aren't countries with a lot of resources to begin with to be able to adapt to the needs that have been put before them.
Steve Davis, do you want to comment on the common threads and perhaps also the challenges of dealing with these different types of refugee crises?
Sure, and maybe I could sort of frame it a little bit from the perspective I bring, which is like, I'm not sure, when you invited me to do this, I'm like, well, we're not a refugee organization.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And yet, the more we pondered it, thought, actually, it's actually quite an important topic, and I appreciate the Hilton Symposium bringing that forward, which is how we all have to be a part of this. And so I did spend my earliest, and to answer your question, my earliest experience back in dating myself way back in the early 80s in this work was on the Lao-Thai border in a camp working, and then very later on at UNHCR. So have been sort of seen that crisis through a variety of phases, and these similar crises through a variety of phases, and now running one of the leading global health innovation organizations. It's sort of like, now how do those two things connect? Well, one is we actually see this sort of, if you go beyond the immediate quality of a refugee crisis, personal, political, but you actually see what we did in Southeast Asia, what we had to do in Rwanda, what that we're all working on now in Syria. There are very common issues. And certainly as I now look at it more through the lens of global health, where we're focused a lot on epidemic and pandemic preparedness and response, I think there are some other similar threads. And a few of those would be, one is there is a sort of, as we think of institution and multi-collaborative approaches, there is what I often think of as just in case work we need to do. And I think that's a thread that we're beginning to talk about more in global health for sure, but in the, how do we get ahead of these things? If they become reasonably predictable, this tends to be a post-conflict situation. Where is the global community and where are our own institutions and where is we a collaboration here can start thinking about that sort of preparedness, its resilience, some of those common themes. And we saw that in Southeast Asia. We sort of should have known, we did know, and yet we were sort of caught still a little bit holding the bag and not understanding what to do. And then I think there's the just-in-time question, which is more the response. Like all at once, we have a crisis. We have yet to figure out a very effective model for collaboration and coordination across these multiple humanitarian crises on everything from supply chain and logistics, which continues to be a big challenge, and who's bringing what supplies in, and is that coordinated, et cetera, to looking at the sort of variety of sectoral issues that will arise. So to John's point, I mean, we know that there's a high correlation between a refugee population and health outcomes and health outbreaks that occur afterwards. And so how do we align around those things? And those actually transcend geography. They have transcended a variety of, I mean, certainly the specific solutions might be very culturally driven or might be very targeted around, the difficulty of reaching a population here or there. But the issues of response, preparedness, supply chain, medical support, policy support, all of those are thematically aligned, and we need to work better on those.
I want to pick up on a couple of threads that several of you have mentioned, but Steve really focused on it just this moment. Humanitarian organizations, it seems to me anyway, generally have been responsive. A crisis arises, humanitarian organizations who know about how to deal with that crisis gear up, deploy, use their expertise, and jump in and solve problems that already exist. But you raised the point of, is there something more preemptive that humanitarian organizations can do? You framed it in terms of preparedness, but let's try to push the envelope even a little beyond that. Maybe all of you could comment on first the issue of being prepared in advance, as Steve mentioned. Should we all be doing more of that kind of planning, predictive planning, for crises that haven't yet occurred, but sure look pretty obvious as though they're going to occur? And then pushing the envelope, is there anything these organizations can do to try to prevent the crisis in the first place? And there we get into policy interventions and so on. Nazanin, do you want to comment on any of this?
Sure. I think I'd start by noting that, to points that fellow panelists have made, 60% of those who are displaced originate from fragile states, what the OECD would call fragile states. And so that says a tremendous amount about where we need to be focusing our energies and what kinds of solutions around institutional responsiveness, inclusive politics, inclusive economies, and resilient societies, the kinds of underlying issues that not just humanitarian actors, but development actors and political actors need to be addressing in fragile state contexts. The other important factor...
And we know where those are,
and
right?
we know
That's
where
your
those
point.
are. We know where those are, and right now they receive the smallest proportion of overseas development assistance, right? We haven't prioritized those fragile states to receive the vast majority of where we put our resources and where we put our efforts. The other thing I'd note is, so 60% of the world's displaced are produced from fragile contexts, but fragile contexts also host 50% of the displaced. And so the pressures that puts on already fragile societies, on already fragile and struggling economies and infrastructures is not insignificant. As John noted, 86% of the world's refugees are hosted in low-income countries. There are 7 countries in the world that, because of their proximity to conflict, host over 50% of the world's refugee population. And Lebanon's Lebanon's population is now a quarter refugees. Jordan is a sixth refugees. So the kinds of tools and solutions that we need to bring to bear, and the diverse set of actors, not just humanitarian responders with their tremendous skill sets, but development actors, different financing entities, the private sector, to bring to bear more long-term solutions that create, again, opportunities for self-reliance, and that create opportunities for both host communities and refugee communities to achieve progress together.
John, are Doctors Without Borders prepared structurally to think ahead and say, we can see a problem about to happen here, let's be prepared to deal with that, we know we're going to have to, what are our resources, what are our capabilities, what are our logistics capabilities, and so on? Or do you find yourselves essentially overwhelmed by existing crises or exploding crises and having to respond to those?
So, to answer the first part of that, what I would say is very much our mode of function is to be prepared for crises and developing in places where it's predictable. So that includes, stockpiling supplies and materials kind of on, and if I could use the term, in advance fronts. So we're sort of sitting and waiting to have something occur and have materials in place near the countries where we would anticipate that would be happening. That's very much a part of the activities and the culture of our logistics side of things. I'd like to get back, though, to what what we were talking about earlier, this whole issue of preventative issues, though. And this room is, and this symposium, full of notable individuals in the public health sphere. And as someone who I would say maybe dabbles in that a little bit versus some of the people who have true expertise in this room, I think it's very much the forefront of medicine overall is not to say what can we do to treat the problem once it's already arisen, but rather what can we do to prevent the problem, because it makes much more sense from a cost standpoint, from a mitigation of adverse outcomes standpoint, to be doing things that are preventative. And so the levels that can be undertaken, I would say, I think that very much is a political responsibility, and I think that we've seen recent pronouncements from the UK, from France, and I think probably to some degree from the US as well, that interventions that were made militarily in various places in the Middle East, in Iraq, and Libya probably weren't well-founded, probably led to destabilization that we really weren't prepared to deal with as a humanitarian community. So can we be more proactive and thoughtful as governments to try to prevent these sorts of things by military interventions or other interventions that we may undertake? I think that would be a big part of the preventative side of things. And I think a second issue related to that, and again, is sitting here on a from the standpoint of more of a humanitarian organization, I think related to that should be the issue of what can be done developmentally. So, we tend to use, and I won't say exclusively, but we tend to use, military support as a means of development, but there's nowhere near enough for energy, for infrastructure, for education in these fragile states. And granted that it's, something that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of energy, but I think it would be funds so much better spent than on organizations like ours that have to then clean up afterwards when seemingly preventable things haven't been adequately dealt with.
Hang on one second. Nazanin, do you want to?
I was reminded with John's good points. An example. So there's both the long-term intervention, the preventative lens that we need to bring to fragile states and developing contexts, and there's also the way in which humanitarian actors can engage in prevention and preparedness around discrete interventions. And I'm thinking now about the upcoming, for example, clearance of Mosul, right? So we've all read in the news about preparations that are underway to clear ISIS from Mosul and the military interventions that will be underway there. What we know from the lessons of Fallujah is that the humanitarian crisis that emerged from that military action really undermined stability in the region. And what we need to bring to bear, and what humanitarians can bring with the lessons that they've learned, is this is in fact the third time that we're going to be clearing Mosul. And so while humanitarians are set up to respond, poorly managed humanitarian crises become political crises of their own, where civilians lose trust in their government, they lose trust in central authorities to be able to protect and care for them. And so humanitarian actors have been at the forefront of planning for Mosul and planning together and seeking entry, seeking a seat at the table to be able to identify the concerns that need to be met up front, that need to be, the kinds of consequences that can be prevented and strategies for mitigating them.
Why are they not getting a seat at the table?
Because we're not, so we're pushing for that, and I would say
We heard you say that.
Yeah. So to credit, I would say that opening is being. I would say we see an opening being created around Mosul, different than, and we're hopeful about that. But humanitarian actors are seen as aid providers. not necessarily people who are deeply knowledgeable about political context, political dynamics, what civilians are suffering, and what it means in terms of the way they assess their future prospects and how they will differently plan how they assess their future prospects, and therefore how they intend to participate or not in political and societal rebuilding.
Steve, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No problem. I was thinking about back to the sort of prevention question, and I think John and Nazanin are right that there's certainly a sort of cascading level of this. Sort of what is the geopolitical? Can we get ahead of that? Can we make smarter political decisions? There's also, of course, the general development thesis, which no one disputes, and the president was so articulate today. If we educate girls and sort of get some stronger health systems, we're going to have much more resilient systems that are going to be much less susceptible. But there are then sort of levels of predictability around different types of crises, humanitarian crises that then lead to refugee and other kinds of humanitarian. So certainly, some natural disasters are completely out of the blue. Some are less so in terms of we know where things are likely to happen. Fragile states emerge slowly. They don't happen overnight, and so we know that. In the global health environment, we've actually taken Ebola, I think, as a wake-up call, which is long overdue. And honestly, you could argue, and maybe cynically, it remains to be seen how much it really mattered. But saying, look, there are with climate and mobility and emerging pathogens, there's no question that that we're going to be seeing more and more pandemics and epidemics almost every year, and those relate directly to refugee flow and to a number of issues surrounding that. And so a number of us have spent a fair amount of time over the last year saying we've got to get smarter. Look, it turns into, I joke about it, it's like the rugby scrum. That there's an outbreak, and then all at once everybody piles on. Nobody's sure who's doing what. It takes a while to sort of piece back the layers. And that's true certainly on the response side, and where we've seen reform needed and some serious reform needed at the WHO and other areas. But we've actually focused a lot on what about the tools and the biomedical interventions around epidemics. So actually a group of both industry leaders, civil society leaders, multilateral leaders came together. We put together a group that's now forming to actually create a more predictable set of follow-through in an epidemic outbreak, including how do we get ahead of what we imagine could be the next outbreaks, and get start working on vaccines and other tools, and making sure there's some stockpile available for those. And so this is it's a big project. It's going to take a lot of complexity to get it right, but it is actually, I think, a nice example of collaboration, smart solutions, and compassion coming together across sector to say we actually can be smarter about how we get ahead of these problems.
Just to make sure I understand it, you're not suggesting that individual humanitarian organizations might actually be working together with governmental organizations and international organizations. That's not what you meant.
Well,
right?
yeah, it's like the big aha, right? And it's not only working together, but sitting down with industry CEOs and
private sector too,
and government leaders, both from across the world, to say, look, shame on us. We haven't gotten our act together on this, and there are things we need to do differently, and let's start creating. We have to, crawl, walk, run. Nobody is thinking this is going to change overnight, but I think it's this group called CEPI, the Consortium on Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. Norway is hosting it. I think we'll see some real positive things come out of this.
Do you two think that there are opportunities for, I hate to use the word collaboration, but cooperation, or where individual organizations might say, we have this expertise, you have that expertise, we're not going to try to duplicate what you're doing, we're going to try to go in together and think about this in advance. Is progress being made on that front? Either one of you.
Sure.
Nazanin? Or
Go ahead,
John?
Nazanin. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think progress is being made on that front, and I think one of the most solid conclusions from the 2016 summits, from the World Humanitarian Summit, from last week's summits, has been that we absolutely need to do things differently to respond to the trends that we see in today's global displacement crisis. And one of the main ways in which we have to do things differently is bringing development and humanitarian actors together to respond to the long-term challenges and to work differently, especially with host governments that are hosting, that are shouldering so much of the global responsibility for hosting refugees. So we see, for example, in the London compacts that were developed in February that brought the World Bank, a development financing institution, host governments, from Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, humanitarian actors, major donors together to develop, a long-term sustainable response compact that included financing to help with the tremendous financial burdens of hosting refugees. In exchange, though, for increased opportunities for refugees to access social services in a more long-term way, where humanitarian actors have been providing those social services, basic needs, but also education, health, access to livelihoods. How do we develop more of a long-term plan that brings all of those actors together around a set of collective outcomes for the refugee population there, and work towards a plan where they can be integrated in national development strategies and have access to more regular and routine social services like the education system, like the health system, and like access to jobs?
John?
And I would concur with what others have said. I think very much that the spirit of collaboration has been increasing year by year, and the idea of humanitarian organizations feeling like they should be the only one in the proverbial sandbox playing is one that's becoming antiquated. And related to that, I think we're really seeing particular areas of expertise or development that various organizations are really crafting themselves around, which then allows for collaboration back and forth and say, you really do this better than we do. Why don't you take over this particular sphere of activity in a given setting? The other thing I'd like to highlight that Steve had brought up is the idea of also venturing outside of working with just other humanitarian actors or NGOs, but also reaching out to academia, reaching out to corporate organizations, because there's actually a great deal of interest from those groups to say, what can we do to help out? We've got this technology that's racing ahead, far faster than we almost know how to apply it, and it's gone to be directed, I think, initially into more business or economic solutions, but I think I would say collectively in this positive spirit that exists amongst mankind that several others have touched on today. This is something that I've been very impressed with recently, is that there's a lot of corporate entities and universities that may not have been traditionally drawn into that are really opening their doors and saying, what can we do to assist you, or how can we help develop various projects that may be of value to you, and work alongside with us, basically.
And I would add, I think we really are in a slightly, a radically over time different environment where a recognition that most of the world's biggest problems have to be driven by multi-sectoral solutions, and that reality has always sort of academically been there, but now we're actually seeing it over the last few years, even last week here. You really see that playing out. Now there are sort of two drivers of that, in my view. One is there's this enormous opportunity as the world's demographic shift, where you've got lower middle income countries, you've got a growing middle class, you've got actually, while the headlines may look dire, the trend lines are quite positive in terms of reduction of maternal child mortality, growth of, the reduction of people in desperate poverty is phenomenal. And that has led to where a world is no longer a pyramid, but it's a diamond. And the diamond is and the poorest people in the world are not just in the poorest countries in the world. And that changes the way we have to think. We no longer should be focused on just fragile countries, but we have to be focused on inequity and low income poor resource settings and rich and poor countries alike, and that's a big issue. The other big game changer, and this is predictable from the guy from the West Coast, right? But it's the digital revolution in all forms. So, and we don't even know yet what that really looks like. And I'm certainly not saying it solves all problems. I've been in conferences where I had to remind people that biology still matters in health, right? The app actually won't create that vaccine. But on the other hand, we actually, with remote access, with social media capabilities to know better what's going on, to mobilize communities different, to be able to use data differently, to track what's going on, where that's huge, and it'll help us a lot in the next
It's our partnership with Microsoft,
Yeah.
I mean, not with Microsoft, with MasterCard that's allowed us to scale up safe, secure, financially secure cash distribution to refugees. It's our partnership with Google that has allowed us to deploy apps so that, and applications so that refugees arriving on the shores of Europe know where to go for information and know how to process their asylum claims. It's, we sit on a steering committee in Lebanon with the Ministry of Education and different and donors and other humanitarian actors to plan for Lebanon's education response. So these changes and these different partnerships with private sector actors, with host governments, with development actors are taking place.
I'm glad you raised the technology question. I was going to ask you a question about technology. I'm going to push another little angle of it. You mentioned, several of you have mentioned the role of the private sector and that there are people out there, John said a minute ago, who are eager to get involved but not really sure how to do it. And I think Nazanin talked about doors opening and so on. Does technology, is the technical revolution, the digital revolution, also playing a role in nudging the academic and the private sector players into saying, this is out there, people are seeing this. Literally, the photographs are circulating massively, the videos are becoming viral. We should be in that space. We, the corporation, we, the technology provider, we, the pharmaceutical company, whatever it is. Is that a concrete factor now that would not have been a factor maybe even 5 or 10 years ago? Is it pushing the collaborative envelope a bit?
I think it is. I think it's hard to sometimes separate sort of what's generational, and what's technological. So for instance, there's a lot of data on the millennials' view of being socially engaged, which is different. And there's a view that may be driven because of the social media. So they're seeing and understanding and having a different point of view. And we certainly see a level of opportunity coming forward from the tech sector, but I also they want to engage. They're looking for ways to engage, not just to do good, but they actually see opportunity. But I would say it's social media, but it's also data. And I mean, this is a world in which you can't not know something once you know it. And so as we start getting smarter about what's really happening and actually have more clear data on what's happening, have visualization of that data, which is happening through these new tools, it's powerful. And I don't mean just in sort of the wonky way someone like me would think about it, but as you go sit with the Minister of Education or Minister of Health of DRC and show what's sort of the dynamics in their community and how can we support their agenda, and that is so powerful to engage more people.
Go ahead. Did you want to comment on the digital aspect?
I was just going to make one quick comment related to it, which is also not to lose sight of the value that it can have for the refugee populations themselves, because there's hardly a place in the world that that doesn't have cell phone connectivity. In fact, it's always astonishing to go to some place that we talk about fragile states, and what's going on is there may not be much sort of cohesive governance of any sort, but there's a cell phone tower being built in the horizon, and so the
refugees have the phones.
Yeah.
They may not have much else, but they've got the phone.
Number one question: do you have Wi-Fi? Where do I get Wi-Fi?
Right.
Yeah. So whether that's getting information on, what would be the best way for me to potentially be trying to direct myself or my family, or whether it could be used as a means to send a text message, kind of broadly in an area to say yellow fever vaccine being administered over the next week. There's a variety of ways that we can use that technology, directly for the populations that we're trying to serve.
And there's a whole new, so to answer the, the beginning of your question, we have seen social media create opportunities for many more people globally to get involved in responding to the crisis in one way or another. I'm sure all of our humanitarian organizations received a similar outpouring of offers of help and support when that terrible picture of Aylan Kurdi appeared last year. So certainly, and it's also opened the door for many more people to come forward with, here's what I have to offer, how can I help? And it relates to the second part of your question. So we're seeing really unique partnerships opening with companies that are built on digital platforms. I'm thinking about gig economy companies like Uber or TaskRabbit or Care.com. And the opportunities that, I think we're just at the beginning of exploring how those gig economy platforms can be applied to livelihood opportunities for refugees and vulnerable populations among their host communities. And it's opening up whole new opportunities for access to livelihoods.
Is this an area where individuals in this audience who work for individual humanitarian groups can benefit from some collective knowledge, some collective experience about how these technologies can work, in some cases do work, and perhaps don't work in some ways? Does everybody have to reinvent that wheel for their own organization and discover, gee, how can we use an app? How can we use the technology? Or as Steve said, how can we use the data? Or is there some opportunity in that sphere for both the private sector and organizations like yours to say, we figured that part out, let us show you how to do that, or let us give you our app, modify it,
Right.
Do something with it.
Right.
Who wants to, anybody, is there an opportunity there?
I mean, I would say, yeah. I think one interesting thing is we always are saying sort of how to get the NGO or the humanitarian community work closer together. And sometimes we're, I think, thinking about it around what's that programmatic thing we should be doing together. And I think we all do. We work with MSF on a number of projects and IRC. But actually, where we might help each other even more is taking some functional areas. We're all trying to figure out how to do better measurement and evaluation, and we're all learning different things. How do we actually get smarter together about that? How do we take the learning agenda around technology and share and learn and actually maybe leverage? I think those are the places that we might find more opportunity than just saying, how do we programmatically work together on the ground in Syria?
That's true. Yes, and I'd say for the IRC, if we sort of think about we have a tremendous ambition to help reform the humanitarian sector, and that has begun with reshaping how we work internally. So we've spent the last year plus reorienting our programs so that they are outcomes focused, so that they cut across silos and allow for multiple collaborators to come together to achieve given outcomes in safety or in health or in livelihoods or in power. In doing that, we have also sort of boiled the ocean on the available evidence. The other thing that we think needs to change in the sector, much more of a focus on evidence, solutions that work for achieving those outcomes. And we have put that onto an open platform and made it open source for all partners to be able to use that and take that on board in their own planning. Another change that we think really necessary in the sector, when you have a year where the international community has never been more generous in its aid, $28 billion last year, but where there was still a 45% deficit in meeting need, that means that we need to be much more focused on the cost efficiency and effectiveness of interventions. So again, at the IRC, we've put a tremendous amount of investment in developing a tool that makes doing cost efficiency analysis easy for any layperson. You don't have to be an economist. You can do it with an online platform and you can get it done in a number of hours wherever you are in the world. Again, seeking to make that open source so that we share that learning with partners in the community. There have been 4,000 studies done, rigorous studies done in development contexts for solutions that work, only 100 in crisis and conflict settings. We at the IRC right now are running 66 research studies, trying to identify solutions that work in these contexts. And in every case, we seek to make that information available to the broadest number of partners.
I know we could continue this conversation, but regrettably, our time allocated for this is out. I think we've opened up a few interesting areas of conversation today. I want to thank you all. Let's say thank you to Steve Davis, Nazanin Ash, and John Lawrence for their participation here today. Thank you all very much.